It is wonderful to be here in this beautiful, really stunning room at the Morgan Library to talk about some really deep questions. I can't think of a better place to do that. And some of those questions include, what does it take for humans to flourish? Is there a scientific theory that explains why we're better off acting cooperatively rather than selfishly? To put it bluntly, is there actually an evolutionary theory of goodness?
Short answer, yes.
So these are hard questions, and I can't think of a better person to help us sort them out than David Sloan Wilson. He's a distinguished evolutionary biologist who taught for many years at Binghamton University. He's been a major figure formulating the evolutionary theory of group selection. And what's especially fascinating about his work is that he crosses many disciplines, from biology to anthropology to the psychology of religion. David has also written many books, including Darwin's Cathedral, Does Altruism Exist?, and a novel called Atlas Hugged, which we will come back to talk more about that. And he's not just an ivory tower intellectual. He spent much of his career applying these ideas to real-world situations, started a project looking at how Darwinian theory can help explain what makes a healthy neighborhood. And more recently, he founded a nonprofit group called Prosocial World to apply these ideas at bigger scales. So we have a lot to talk about, and it is my great pleasure to welcome David
Thank you
Sloan
so much.
Wilson. So, David, I want to start with some personal history, which is really quite fascinating. So your father, Sloan Wilson, was a novelist who wrote the landmark book, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which really helped define a generation. So this was sort of the era of the rise of the suburb. There was all this talk about the company man, the culture of conformity, and essentially sort of it seemed like the American dream had been hollowed out. Your father wrote about all of this. Now, you were just a kid at the time, right? How old were you when that book came out?
I was 8 years old.
How aware were you of your father's stature as a novelist?
So The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit was about the corporate army that formed after World War II. And this was the materialistic world where everyone was striving to get a bigger house and to increase their status, and the ultimate meaninglessness of all of that. And I think so the theme of that book is still very much with us today when we talk about the emptiness and the meaninglessness of our lives today. I think is because that legacy still continues. And as an 8-year-old boy, I was very aware of my father's fame. He was just, sought after wherever we went. People were hanging on his words. And one of the things I learned from that is that whatever he had was better than money, power, or pedigree. Everyone was just hanging on his words. And I think it actually immunized me against being intimidated by powerful people when I grew up. But in the eyes of an 8-year-old boy, looking at my father was like staring up at Mount Everest and thinking, so I'm supposed to repeat that act?
Well, I can imagine that can cut two ways. It's like you might want to run totally in the opposite direction, or you might want to try to emulate that.
Well, I think yes, and I think anyone who has parents that are like that are just oversized, outsized parents, I think, is familiar with the dilemma. And in my case, what I did was I think it includes all my hobbies and in addition to my career choices, that I wanted to do something that he could admire but could not be directly compared to him. And so I chose to become a scientist. And because I have a deep love of nature, then I became an ecologist, not a laboratory scientist, but an ecologist. So that's basically, I had to be a seed that fell far enough from the tree so that I couldn't be directly compared to my dad.
So were you the kind of kid who would sort of, run around in nature, sort of looking at the tiny creatures and sort of trying to understand how it all added up?
Well, I had, during the school year, I just lived in suburbia, various towns around New York City. But in the summers, we summered on the north end of Lake George. And if you've ever been to the north end of Lake George, you know that's one of the most beautiful lakes in the world.
In the Adirondacks.
In the Adirondacks. And my father's family had an old hotel, Adirondack Hotel, which was decommissioned after World War II, but the property remained with a bunch of cottages on the property. And so every summer we'd go up there and there'd be like a mile of shoreline. And there could be no more amazing upbringing for a boy. And so, yes, I was that kid that spent all my time outdoors.
So the title of the series that we're doing is called Becoming Human. And, we're going to examine this question of what does it take for human beings to flourish. But I think your career actually started studying plankton, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to be an ecologist, or an aquatic ecologist. And there's that old joke about scientists learning more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing. And I was on that track. But when I entered graduate school, which was in the 1970s, this was just at a time when Darwin's theory of evolution was proving its explanatory scope. Basically, that when I asked questions about animals, any animals, zooplankton or any other animals, I could actually ask questions, how would this animal, what would this animal or plant be like if it was shaped by natural selection? And so evolutionary thinking had become a kind of a passport for studying any question in any organism. It was the opposite of the old joke. And I think it's like the best kept secret about evolutionary theory is how it just transcends silos and disciplinary boundaries. First, within biology, so I didn't have to just spend my life studying zooplankton. I could study anything and everything, and did. And then, let's include humans while we're at it. And when people say that I study religion and economics and business and just anything I please, it's not due to me. It's due to this theory that I want you all to know about. So anyhow, this is why I've become an evangelical for Darwin's theory of evolution.
So over the years, you have become a prominent advocate of a theory called group selection, and there's been a lot of controversy over this over the years. Of course, Richard Dawkins wrote his famous book, The Selfish Gene, which talked about how evolution happens not just at the individual level, at the individual genes level. And there's been a lot of debate about this, and you have gone up against Dawkins and other people of that ilk. But before we get into the theory of group selection, can you sort of paint a picture of how this debate has played out over the last few decades?
Yeah, sure. And I think that it's important I always like to situate things in a historical context, because I do think we're living in historic times, and we really need to understand that we're playing a role in history. And so if you go back to that period, the mid-20th century, what we find is not only in my field of evolution that it was the era of the selfish gene and the selfish individual, but it was also the advent of the rational actor in economic theory, Homo economicus we call it, and in the social sciences something called methodological individualism. And so at that time, across the board, like a tide that lifts all boats, it was as if we could only understand social phenomenon by understanding them by reducing them to individual action, or even further to gene interactions. Otherwise, we don't understand them. And so this was an age of reductionism, and selfish gene thinking was a part of that. In part because it was easier to do math on it, and so superficially it seemed more scientific, that if you were more systemic and if you were more appreciative of complexity, you could only talk about it in words. You couldn't write equations around it. And so this kind of reductionism had a veneer of science around it.
What was wrong with that theory, though, from your perspective?
Well, let me count the ways. I mean, in the first place, evolution is much, much more about genes. I mean, it's whole organisms that evolve. Genes are parts of whole complex biological systems. In the second place, there's more to evolution than genetic evolution, as we've seen. Darwin knew nothing about genes. He talked about heredity. And so, if anything, if any trait is replicated by any means, that's an evolutionary process. And so that's why we can take this theory and we can apply it to such things as cultural evolution or artificial intelligence. The three ingredients of an evolutionary process are variation, everything tends to vary; selection, those differences make a difference in survival and reproduction; and replication. So any process that includes those three ingredients is an evolutionary process with certain consequences. And genetic evolution is just one of them. And then finally, what's taken place since then is that we've developed tools, thanks to computers, so we actually can model complexity in more than just words. And so now there's a science of complexity, but it didn't really exist before the advent of computers. And so just as I said that reductionism was a tide that lifted or sank all boats, I think now we're entering an age of complexity, as well we should, that is also lifting all boats. And across the board in all these different topic areas, we are now able to take a more systemic view of the world that appreciates the complexity that's already out there.
So I want to come back to this debate over the selfish gene versus kind of a different way of thinking. And there are these bigger questions about, are we humans inherently selfish, or are we more cooperative? And one of the big debates I know has been about the nature of altruism and whether you can really explain altruism at a scientific level. I know this, we can get into the weeds here, and I don't want to go too deeply into that, but
let me take you into the weeds. I want to take you into the weeds.
Can you sketch out sort of the fundamental, the case for why you can really explain altruism and cooperative behavior through science, through evolution?
Yeah, it's super simple, and it is something which Darwin encountered. We could go all the way back to Darwin. And so Darwin thought that his theory could explain all aspects of design that had been previously attributed to a creator. And eventually he discovered that there was one important class of traits that he could not yet explain with his theory, which is altruism and everything else that we associate with the word prosociality. Basically, any behavior that's oriented towards the welfare of others or one's group as a whole. Now, why is that? It's because if natural selection favors individuals that survive and reproduce better than other individuals, how can it possibly explain behaviors that benefit others or one's group as a whole? And so he was faced with a dilemma. But it was a dilemma that had a simple solution, which is, even though selfishness beats altruism within groups, groups of altruists outcompete groups of selfish individuals who cannot cohere. And so, as I put it with my namesake, Edward O. Wilson,
who you worked with, you collaborated on this theory,
was selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, everything else is commentary. So the idea is that natural selection not only operates among individuals within groups, it also operates among groups in a larger population, two levels of selection. And as long as the group level is strong enough, because these are opposing forces, as long as it's strong enough, now we can explain altruism and all other forms of prosociality as an outcome of evolution. But note that special conditions are required. It is not the case that, and this is so important, and it's so disturbing in a way, that functional organization can exist at small scales, like organisms that are exquisitely designed to survive and reproduce. They're designed more perfectly than any watch. And then that functional organization can cease to exist at higher scales. And so those perfect individuals now start warring with each other. And as groups or as ecosystems, actually, they're now dysfunctional. This is, I think this maps onto the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. The first truth is life is full of suffering. So there's so much suffering in nature in addition to human life. The second noble truth is why? Because everyone's trying to satisfy their separate cravings. Their separate cravings. That's why they're harming others. And then we have the third and fourth noble truths. But I think that's the true message of evolution, is that even though it produces such exquisite functional organization at lower levels, such as the organism, then that does not necessarily extend to social groups or ecosystems or forests, or unless special conditions are met.
So I can see that this is a really important question among evolutionary biologists. I mean, there is huge debate about how do you explain prosocial behavior, altruism. Is this just an academic debate, or are there real implications here for the wider world?
Well, of course there is, and I think that because, of course, we need to have an explanation of our species and compared to other primate species. And when you compare our species to our closest relatives, and frankly, many, many other animal societies, what we discover is that those societies would be despotic in human terms. Naked aggression is over 100 times more frequent in a chimpanzee community than in a human small-scale society. So something happened in our species which caused us to be far, far more cooperative than most other primate species. And so this is basically human origins, of course, becomes an evolutionary story, but it also becomes a group selection story, a multi-level selection story, that what took place in our species was that we evolved mechanisms that suppressed disruptive selection within groups so that the group became the cooperative unit. And this actually stands against the idea that the long-standing idea that we were born selfish and then we have to learn to be cooperative. I think what's really amazing is that in our entire history as a species, we never lived alone. We always lived in the context of highly cooperative groups, even when those groups were warring with other groups. And so you can say that cooperation is like baked into our brains and bodies, but that's not to say that it's unconditional.
Well, it seems like there's a deeper question here. It's probably not a yes or no question, but are humans fundamentally good or bad?
I think humans are fundamentally able to, I'm going to be too geeky for this. I have the answer in a sense is both, okay? And another point I want to make in part of this, so for example, I just said that we basically evolved to function in the context of highly cooperative groups. That does not mean that there's no incentive to cheat. Because the reason the groups are cooperative is they're well protected against cheating. People are trying to cheat all the time, but for the most part, they're prevented from doing so. This is what morality is all about. Morality is all about creating norms, ways that we're expected to behave, with consequences if we don't. So punishment and social control is part of groups, and that's
there's policing bad behavior. That's a key
yes,
piece
we have. It's absolutely. So this is like altruism with attitude. It's not just unconditional niceness. This is definitely altruism with attitude. But then, to make matters worse, or at least more complicated, once groups become highly cooperative internally, how do they behave towards other groups? And the entire problem replicates itself. I call this the perverse alchemist problem. The perverse alchemist turns gold into lead. And so cooperation within groups becomes an agent of disruptive competition between groups. The same problem gets elevated, basically. And to solve that problem, there needs to be a new level of selection among groups of groups. And let me just illustrate this. One of my favorite illustrations that makes it obvious to anyone is the game of Monopoly. And so imagine playing the game of Monopoly, you know it, in which this is a process of competition among individuals within a single group. And isn't it interesting that there's almost no context for cooperation in the single game of Monopoly? The only context is when the current losers team up to beat the current winner so that they can then turn on each other. Okay. And so if we build social environments that are like the single game of Monopoly, we're flexible enough to play that game and even enjoy it. So now imagine playing a Monopoly tournament in which the trophy goes to the team that collectively develops its real estate the fastest. Now it's all about teamwork. There's no context for within-group competition. It's all about between-group competition. And don't you know, we turn on a dime and we function as team players. I've actually done this with high school science clubs. And so, but then, of course, there's no context for cooperation among the teams in the game as it's been configured. For that, we'd need to have a tournament of tournaments. And so there you go. What seems complicated for evolution, we can actually understand perfectly well by just thinking about the game of Monopoly.
So are you saying that because there are a lot of other animals who are prosocial. I mean, we think of the social insects, bees and ants. There are many myriad anecdotal reports of one animal helping
Much
another.
more than anecdotal, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, scientifically studied. But are you saying cooperation among humans it's at a different level than any other animal species?
So in many species, most species, you might say we find a mosaic of traits, a mosaic of selfish and prosocial traits that evolve by within or between group selection. In some species, mechanisms have evolved to suppress selection within groups to the point that the group itself becomes the main unit. It becomes so cooperative that we want to call it a superorganism. And that's an elite club. So, and it includes not just the eusocial insects, but it includes a number of other species that have kind of passed this threshold and have become ultrasocial super organisms. And do you know everything that we call an organism, like a multicellular organism like you or me, or a nucleated cell compared to bacterial cells, are actually social groups that have become so cooperative that they've passed this threshold, and we just use the word organism for them. And so what we can say about humans is that they've joined this elite club. That we qualify, at least much of the time, as an ultrasocial species, first at the small scale, because we have to think of all of human history leading up to the present, but at least at the scale of hunter-gatherer societies, including current hunter-gatherer societies. There's a wonderful literature on how this trick of an egalitarian society that polices itself is current in most hunter-gatherer societies today. And then, of course, we have to explain the whole course of human history, the last 12 or 15,000 years, in which we've grown into the mega societies of today. And even though every nation can be improved, there's a degree of cooperation that would have just been unimaginable to our ancestors. Yeah. Unimaginable.
So are you saying that humans are actually, we have become wired to be, I mean, there's something that has sort of changed in our, I don't know, brain structure to become more cooperative?
Yes, although in the way that I've described, which also admits selfishness. And there's a story I love to tell about one of my colleagues named Jim Cohen, who's a clinical neuroscientist at the University of Virginia. And he was counseling an old man, an old World War II veteran that was experiencing late onset PTSD and wouldn't do anything, he said. He was just totally unresponsive to therapy. And eventually this old man said, I want my wife with me. I want to bring my wife with me. And Jim had never had this request before. That's how individualistic therapy is. And so his wife came, and at first Jim just treated her as a bystander, and he was no more receptive than before. And then his wife said, let me hold his hand. I always tear up when I tell this story. So she held his hand, and the old man became receptive to therapy. And Jim was stunned, and he just asked the question, what is going on in this man's brain that the act of holding hands just transformed everything? And so we started to do experiments in which he got anybody to go into a fMRI machine, and then he would stress them with the threat of electric shocks, and then he would see what was happening in their brains under three conditions: alone, holding the hands of a loved one, and holding the hands of a stranger. And holding the hands of a loved one had this tremendous calming effect. And based on this, he developed something called social baseline theory, which says basically this. Our social environment has been to always exist in the context of highly cooperative groups, even when they were warring with other groups. What that means is individuals always had social resources to rely upon in addition to their personal resources. And that's what our brains and bodies have evolved to expect. Our brains and bodies have evolved to expect social support in addition to our individual our resources. And in modern life, therefore, if you take away the social support and you only have the lone individual, the brain and body interprets that as an emergency situation, And so if you want to help somebody out therapeutically, get them into a group where they get appropriately structured group, where they can have social support, and that's the single most helpful thing you can do. And there's a lot of research that demonstrates that.
So I want to come back to your personal story. So I mentioned at the outset that you wrote a novel. You took a page out of your dad's book. You wrote a novel called Atlas Hugged, which is obviously a takeoff on Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, and Ayn Rand was the apostle of selfishness. You know, this was her novel sort of spelling out, making the case for selfishness, and she was a huge advocate of capitalism as sort of the foundation of moral virtue. Why did you want to go after Ayn Rand?
So I think the editor of Nautilus is here, I think. Yeah. And I don't know if it was you who titled my Nautilus article, I have come to destroy Ayn Rand or something like something. I've come to bury Ayn Rand, yes. Well, it actually wasn't my idea. I was starting to get into economics from an evolutionary perspective now 15 years ago, and I'd organized a workshop. And at that workshop, somebody else said, well, you know, Ayn Rand did such a great job championing these ideas through fiction. Shouldn't somebody be doing the same for these new ideas? And in a flash, the title, Atlas Hugged, flew into my mind, and the elements of the plot line became clear that my book would be about the grandson of John Galt, the protagonist of Atlas Hugged, and his father would have been some public media figure like Rush Limbaugh, and that this would be a titanic battle between father and son. And it was so appealing. You know, we call ourselves storytelling animals, and of course we all know we love listening to stories. But to create a story at length, I discovered, was just the most engrossing thing ever. And by the time I was done, there were 60 characters in my novel. It was just like it wasn't even my choice to write it. And it took 7 years. And in that novel, a worldwide transformation takes place in 100 days. And so that's not going to happen, but much else. And no, this also, it's so interesting that to such an extent, because we do construct our own social environments, we can and do imagine our worlds, and then turn them into a reality. And because my novel co-evolved with my work on economics, I'm borrowing phrases from my novel, and actually when I'm in a real world setting. And so take your pick. You can the fictional form or the non-fictional form. But
so I want to come back in a moment to sort of the real world implications of what you're talking about. But just to follow up on Ayn Rand, so she's been dead for decades, but there still is an Ayn Rand Institute. Did they read your novel?
Yeah, they did. They hated it, as you might assume. No, Ayn Rand's influence is still great, and this tradition that my father critiqued 70 years ago, and Atlas Shrugged appeared just within a few years of The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, is still with us, is still dominating the economic landscape. We call it neoclassical economics, and just this morning, literally a few hours ago, I was on a 3-hour online economics conference sponsored by the UN, in which this was all the topic. And what they were saying was, you know, we're still dominated by the neo-classical paradigm. And what we need, they said, is a new source code. A new source code. And I think one of the points that this illustrates, which is a little bit subtle, but I don't feel that it should be subtle, that and I think it was alluded to in your introduction, that at some level, in order to change the way we act, we must change the way we think on the inside. In order to change what we do on the outside, we must change the way we think on the inside. I mean,
explain what you mean. I mean, who's the we here, and what the inside being what?
The inside being what we call your meaning system. The vocabulary for this is quite impoverished, or you might say vague. So what is inside your head? Do we call it a religion? Do we call it a theory? Do we call it a worldview? Do we call it a meaning system? But whatever it is, it's cultural. It's not your genes. You are a collection of genes. We call that your genotype. Those genes influence just about everything that could be measured in you. We call that your phenotype. So that's biology. Well, you also have this collection of symbols inside your head. Let's call it your symbotype, just to stress the comparison. We do. That's now become a term. And your symbotype influences just about everything that could be measured in you, along with your genotype. In fact, maybe even more so. And so your meaning system, whatever we want to call it, your symbotype, is literally the cultural equivalent of your genes. And just as your genes result in a repertoire of behaviors, our genes endow us with quite a bit of flexibility. We're not just evolved to do X, we're evolved to respond to our environments in certain ways. We have a repertoire, but to go beyond that repertoire, we would have to change our genes. And gene therapy exists to do so. Well, so it is with our symbotypes. They give us a repertoire of behavior, but in order to go beyond that repertoire, we have to change our symbolic systems.
What do we need to change in our symbolic systems? What's the source code that we're trying to replace, or that we need to replace, and what's the new source code that is required for this moment in history?
So I would say that in an economics context, the old source code is this neoclassical paradigm, which is tightly integrated. And the new source code is a combination, as I said at the beginning of this talk, of complex system science and evolutionary science. This is something which already serves is foundational basically for every other subject, every other complex subject, physics, chemistry, biology, whatever. And it deserves to be the foundation for basically all human activities. So
this sounds like a very academic question here, but I know you don't want to just leave it in the ivory tower. You want to bring this out to the real world. So what are the implications if you actually implement this new source code?
Well, here I want to maybe introduce a name, and when I do this, I speak a lot about an archipelago of knowledge and practice. I think that without a comprehensive theory, then what we have are many islands of thought and practice with little communication among islands. It's like a vast archipelago. And earlier on, I said that evolution provides this passport, so it dissolves those disciplinary boundaries. And so it's against this background that I can list a person that everyone should know about, but not everyone does. Her name, and I'm going to ask for a raising of hands, is Elinor Ostrom. Who all has heard of Elinor Ostrom? Isn't that interesting? Only a few.
Two people, maybe.
Only a few. Elinor Ostrom. She was a political scientist, and she ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. Although she was the biggest outlier, maverick ever to win the Nobel Prize. What she did was she studied the famous tragedy of the commons. Who's all heard of the tragedy of the commons? Quite a few more. This is the tendency for groups that are managing common pool resources to basically overexploit the resource, to take more than their share. And economic wisdom held that the tragedy would always occur, and so this is the argument for privatization, privatizing resources, or top-down regulation. And what Elinor Ostrom showed was that actually groups that are managing their resources, they can self-govern, but only if special conditions are met. And those special conditions map onto what we would predict from this evolutionary perspective. In other words, mechanisms, and let me just list them because they're very straightforward. So let me ask you to imagine a group, any group that you know well. I don't care how well it works or how poorly it works. So please bring a group to your mind and then ask yourself the question, how does your group implement these 8 core design principles? I can get through them very fast, and then you can pull me out of the weeds. So number 1, does your group have a strong sense of identity and purpose? Is it a meaningful group? Do you know what it's about? Who's in it? Strong sense of identity and purpose. Number 2, are benefits proportional to cost? Is it the case that what you get from the group is proportional to what you give? Or is it the case that some people are benefiting without contributing to the objectives of the group? Number 3, is decision-making fair and equitable? Is every member of the group taking part in the decision-making process as they should? Number 4, are agreed-upon behaviors monitored? Do we know that we're doing what we're supposed to do? And if we are we rewarded? And if we're not, is there some kind of corrective which starts out mild and friendly but then escalates as needed? Number 6, is there fast and fair conflict resolutions? Number 7, is there authority to self-govern so you're not being bossed around by some outside influence? And number 8, are your relations with other groups appropriate, implementing the same principles, or these principles are scale independent? So with apologies for going through it so fast, let me ask you the question. If your group implemented these core design principles, I'll bet you money that that group functions well as a group, because it has the structure to prevent disruptive self-serving behaviors. But if your group does not implement those core design principles, then it's easy pickings for the single game of Monopoly. It's that simple. And so these ideas, which explain the presence and absence of prosociality in all of life, also explains the presence and absence of prosociality in our groups. And that's the relevance. That's how we can take these ideas which seem abstract, and now that every single group should be knowing about these core design principles.
So let me drill down to a more concrete example. And I know you were involved in a project studying the neighborhoods of your hometown of Binghamton, New York, and something you called the Binghamton Neighborhood Project. What did you find out about what makes a good neighborhood or a poorly functioning neighborhood?
So the first thing we did, and this was my exit from the ivory tower, basically. I mean, these ideas did seem so important to me that I thought, we have to just use these ideas. We can't just be studying them. So I made friends with the school superintendent in Binghamton. Her name was Peggy Wozniak, a wonderful woman. And through her, I was able to give a survey to all of the public school students in grades 6 through 12. That's actually a lie, because to do a study like this, I learned that there's, on any given day, there's so many absentee students that we didn't get all of them, but we did get most of them. And what this survey measured was 2 things. First of all, how prosocial are you as an individual? How do you answer a question such as that, in my community, I think it's important to be a solid citizen. I think it's important to help with straightforward questions about how prosocial are you or not. And you might question the accuracy of that kind of questionnaire. We could go there, but trust me that this actually is useful knowledge. And then the other information we gathered was that how much social support do you receive from a number of sources? Your family, your neighborhood, your school, your church, and extracurricular activities. And what theory tells us is that for prosociality to be maintained in a Darwinian world, those who give must get. If you are a giver, give, you will disappear unless you're getting from social support. And that's what we found. We found that at the scale of the entire city, we found a very, very strong correlation between the prosociality of the individual and the prosociality of their social environment. And even though these sources of social support need not be spatially based, like your church or your school might be far away from your neighborhood, there was a very, very strong spatial component to this correlation. And so when we mapped the distribution and abundance, that's an ecological term, of prosocial behavior in the city of Binghamton, we found this tremendous heterogeneity that on a scale from 1 to 100 for an individual, neighborhoods could vary by as many as 50 points. So we were getting hotspots of prosociality and hills and valleys of prosociality in which we could now then use that as a basis to maybe change that landscape. And then
So for the neighborhoods that aren't working well, what people are just not helping each other out? What
no, in
goes
one
wrong?
way there's a venerable method in social psychology called the lost letter method. What you do is you get a bunch of stamped envelopes and you put a fake address on them, and then you put your address as the return address, and then you drop them all over the city. And then you see who's kind enough to pick up the envelope and mail it for you. And so we did that study all over the city, and what we found out is that this small act of kindness mapped perfectly well onto the heterogeneity that and we did many other experiments like that. So we actually demonstrated that these were more else. We also did like Christmas decorations and Halloween decorations, yard sales. All of these are just expressions of neighborliness. And so we could show that our prosocial hills actually glowed more brightly during the holiday season. And then we did an intervention. We had an opportunity to create a school within a school for at-risk students. And to make a long story short, we designed this school with these core design principles in mind. And to attend the school, you had to have flunked at least 3 or more classes the previous year. We did a randomized control trial, which means that we recruited twice as many individuals as could attend, and then the rest became randomly selected, became a control group. We did not actually teach the core design principles. We baked them into the environment, and then we observed what happened, and there was a transformative effect, a huge difference. And not only did the students in the school perform much, much better than the comparison group, they performed on a par with the average public school student in the entire school system. That's the degree which prosociality is actually a flexible behavior. That's another point to make. If you're not being prosocial, it's not because you're just like have prosocial, selfish genes or anything like that. You're in a situation in which it's dangerous to be prosocial, and you're sensible enough to pull into your shell like any good turtle or snail. Give someone an opportunity to be prosocial without endangering themselves, and most people, including these students, came out of their shells soon enough.
So this you're talking about at the neighborhood level, at the city level. I'm wondering how much you can scale up this idea. I mean, to actually encourage, to promote prosocial behavior at a, regional level, ultimately at the national level, at the planetary level. I mean, is that just pie in the sky thinking, or is that possible?
It is, in the first place, it's necessary. And in the second place, these principles are scale independent. And so no matter what the scale, then the same ingredients are needed. And so that's a tremendous conceptual simplification. And we find, for example, if you look at well-known books such as Why Nations Fail by Darren Asimoglu and Robinson, which is a comparison of nations, they make a distinction between nations that are extractive or inclusive, a spectrum from extractive or inclusive. Inclusive nations basically share their benefits more than extractive nations. The Nordic countries are among the most inclusive nations. And then they show that basically this maps on to how well they function as groups. So our comparison of design principles actually work perfectly well at the national scale. They do explain variation in performance. And then again, there's the question is, how can we intervene? How can we, knowing this, what can be done. And then on that point, if you take the United States, this is work of my colleague Peter Turchin. Currently, the United States is like number one in inequality. But that's not true for its entire history. So if you look at the history of the United States, what you find is that in terms of how inclusive it is, it looks like a roller coaster, that if you go down to the 1830s, when Tocqueville visited America, that was called by historians the era of good feelings. And then so benefits were widely shared. Then we have the first Gilded Age with extreme inequality. Then we have a new rise to what we call the New Deal, which was a good deal for some, not everyone. Very important to make that point. And now we slid down to the second Gilded Age.
We're in a new Gilded Age now.
We're in a new Gilded Age. And so in a sense, these same ideas, which we can apply at the scale of small groups, we need to apply at the national scale. And it can make sense of both variation among nations plus the history of single nations. And then the final step of that is if we want to avoid the perverse alchemist problem, then we must elevate this to the global scale. And so the global scale, global cooperation must be our objective. It must be our first core design principle, basically, is what we do. We should be saying, first and foremost, I am a human being and citizen of the world. And even though I function in many different kinds of groups, smaller groups, all the way down to the tiny groups of my life, everything I do needs to be coordinated with the global good in mind. And that might seem to be utopian, but I'm prepared to argue that actually, no, not at all. It's immensely practical, and that there's many positive examples.
What are some examples? I mean, it sounds like absolutely we need this, especially in this time of climate crisis, of environmental catastrophe. Where do you find hope here?
So one point to make is that the idea of global cooperation was unimaginable until maybe even only 2 or 3 centuries ago. People just had no way of envisioning that. And so, for example, the Baha'i faith was one of the first religions that was truly a global religion, all nations, all faiths. And so the idea of the United Nations, the League of Nations, these only became imaginable basically a very short time ago. But by now, the forces of globalization are so great that it's really hard to imagine anything else. I mean, every day we're talking with people from the other side of the world on Zoom. In my school in Binghamton, in the public high school, the superintendent told me over 20 first languages are spoken in that one tiny little school district. And so all our products come from all over the world. And so the idea that there's a single world and that we're inextricably bound up in it, I think has just become the new reality for us. And to have a noble goal, if we want to shrink ourselves down to the level of businesses, then what we find in some of the most progressive business movements, such as the B Corps movement or conscious capitalism, when we find companies that have adopted these core design principles and are functioning very well as companies, one of the things that animates them and animates their employees is the noble purpose. It makes you proud that you're working for a company that's doing no harm, that's not putting its externalities out into the world. It motivates you. And so at smaller scales, to have a noble purpose, I think, is something which it's really at the center of what we think of with the best of religion and spirituality. So there's a sense in which if you're in a group and you want your group to function well, but you also want it to do no harm, then that group can be very strong. So,
Wasn't Google, didn't it have its motto at one point, do no harm, and then it retracted that?
once upon a time. And but we can talk. This is in general terms that this is all ends up being a balance of power. That if you are an agent, an entity, including a Leviathan organization such as a tech company, and you gain a monopoly, then there's really nothing preventing you from just exploiting power advantages. And so it does require checks and balances. There will be selfish actors at any scale. You must have some way to counter that kind of selfish behavior. And if not, then you're going to get basically disruptive self-serving behaviors.
David, coming back to your personal history, what I find so striking, if I just sort of look at the arc of your career, is you've devoted the latter part of your life to meaning making. I mean, and you're applying science to these principles, which I find so fascinating, because I think a lot of scientists really don't want to touch these questions of meaning, of purpose, and all of that. That seems kind of unscientific. And I'm wondering sort of if you could put this in perspective for you and for other people in your profession.
Well, I mean, we do have a sort of a stereotype of a scientist that just wants to discover the facts, no matter what they might be. Is curiosity-driven, just facts for facts' sake. Also in economics, they make a distinction between what they call positive and normative economics. Positive economics is just studying economic systems. Other people make the value judgments. But I think that more and more we need to be normative, basically, in our scientific knowledge. And there's many, many people like that. I think if you're a philosopher, then you know that the tradition of pragmatism in philosophy was always like that, always pointed out that basically knowledge is basically what works in the world. And so I think that, and also there's a division between like the basic sciences and the applied sciences. And so, if you're in a psychology department or an anthropology department, you might just be generating knowledge. But if you're a sociologist or if you're in public health or something like that, then you're definitely using knowledge for good. So bottom line is I hope that I'm not unusual in this. And I think that especially from an evolutionary perspective, this is, I think, that where a lot of what I have to offer is just that I take what's business as usual for an evolutionary biologist and applying that to novel contexts. So when I was studying birds and bees and fish and insects, it went without saying that to understand them at all, you had to study them in the field, as they go about their lives. And so when I started to study humans, it was just like, please, in the field, if I could, let us study humans as they exist in their natural environments. And even though the applied sciences have been doing that all along, they've typically had a poor cousin relationship with the more pure. We even call it soft and hard and things like that. But to study humanity in the context of their natural environments is the best basic science that can be done. And so there's truly a win-win situation in which fundamental knowledge and applied knowledge take place in parallel. They don't need to be sequential.
Where does religion fit into your thinking?
Well, how much time do we have left, Stephen?
You wrote a whole book, probably more than one, about religion and applying some of these evolutionary principles to it.
Well, if you're interested in altruism and you become interested in humans, then you cannot fail to be interested in religion. And it's religious groups that like to describe their own communities as superorganisms, the body of Christ.
And you've identified as being an atheist, right?
Yes, I'm an atheist, although I was doing a podcast like this and someone asked me if I believed in God, and I said, the short answer is no, but the long answer is yes. And so I think that there's a sense in which I'm quite happy to call myself religion. but then I have to qualify it. Because, and this is, I think, such a super interesting point, as you know, because you're, like me, you're a fellow traveler studying religion from a scientific perspective. There are two major definitions of religion, and they do not map onto each other at all. Definition number one has to do with belief in supernatural agents. Definition number two is Durkheim's definition of a community that's united as a moral community that's united over the concept of sacred. And so one deals with belief in supernatural agents. The other deals with religions as something which creates strong moral communities. And it's Durkheim's definition that can be validated. If you look at enduring religions, what you find is that they're exceptionally good at forming strong moral communities. And it didn't have to be that way. Because if you look at the so-called New Atheist movement, my friend Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, both of whom were just huge spokespeople for evolution, and Chris Hitchson and Sam Harris, they wanted you to know that religion is just bad, bad, bad. It's a mind virus. Best done without it. But come to actually do the science, what you can find is that most enduring religions are exceptionally good at creating communities. They're cultural superorganisms, and we need to study them with the same respect and admiration that we study biological species. So when you take cultural evolution seriously, what you conclude is that the big bushy tree of cultural life is like the big bushy tree of biological life. And so these cultural forms are like species. And just as I love the species I study, even if they're predators or parasites or diseases, they're still so amazing in what they do and in their ability to survive and reproduce in a challenging world, we should look at cultural forms that way. Even if those cultural forms are predatory or disruptive, that's what it means to study them as a evolutionist. And then, of course, when we put our normative hat on, then, of course, we need to resolve conflicts. And that's already taking place. If we look at, for example, the Dalai Lama and his book titled Beyond Religion, what does he say? He never loses the opportunity to say, there's 8 billion people in this world, and they will never gather under a single religion. Therefore, we need something else. We need an ethics for the whole world. And here's my version of it. Pope Francis says, our common home. He was not just speaking to Catholics. He was speaking for the whole world. And so this is against sense, once again, that despite the fact that it was impossible to have a whole earth ethic even 200 years ago, now it's the only thing that makes sense. And even religious leaders understand that, and they're reaching for a whole world ethic.
So in this definition of religion, I think you would call yourself a spiritual person. And I guess I'm wondering, at a very personal level, what does the sacred mean to you?
Well, I love words, key words for religion, because each and every one of them is also commonly used outside religion. So take sacred for an example. What does it mean to treat something as sacred? It means that you value it so much that you subordinate yourself to it. You are willing to serve it. That's what it means to be sacred. And that is the meaning of the word, whether you're using it in a secular context or in a religious context. The same is true for worship or even God. God is the good that I worship, I think, is the meaning of that word. And when you take the fact that we're an ultra-cooperative species, that we evolved to live in highly cooperative groups. When those groups are functioning well, and that first core design principles is we're in a group that's really doing something as a group. And in an evolutionary context, that was literally survival, your group. That was your life. Then to treat that as sacred and to subordinate yourself to it is just like, it's the evolved psychology of being part of something larger than yourself. If a cooperative group means that the members of cooperative groups are taking part of something larger than themselves. What psychology would fit that like a glove? And it's the psychology that we associate with spirituality and religion.
So in a moment, I want to go to questions from our audience, but just a comment. This has been such a wonderful conversation because it's just, when I look out at the state of the world right now, it seems pretty grim. You just see wars everywhere, you see trouble, you see polarization, and yet you are here to give us some hope, I think.
I am hopeful, and I think that when we apply this to our current situation, and we see so much polarization, I think the reason is that our middle ground has failed us. When we look at what we think of as the middle ground and all of the policies that our politicians, no matter left or right, have attempted to do for the middle ground, those policies have not worked for either people or planet. The middle ground, you might say, has failed us. And I think that this new foundation of evolution and complexity, as geeky and scientific as that sounds, does provide a foundation for a new middle ground, basically policies that work in a very pragmatic sense.
When you say middle ground, can you spell that out?
Well, in a political sense, we have, left and right, center left, center right, extreme left, extreme right, and what we've seen is a hollowing out of the center and more people basically being driven to extremes is what we're seeing. And so the question would be, is there a foundation from which we can derive policies that just plain work? And so this doesn't slot into any current political ideology. If there is, and we can simply solve our complex problems, then anybody would want to adopt such policies. And the proof is in actually doing that. But there's a sense in which I think the middle ground has failed us for lack of the right theoretical foundation. And now having that foundation, we can rebuild the middle ground, and we can do it at a number of scales. So we can do this. You don't have to ask permission, basically. Whatever your current capacity is, you can just start doing it, and then it can prove itself from there. So yes, I am hopeful.
Okay, with that final note here, I do want to turn it to questions or comments from our audience.
Yeah, I do think that all of us are faced all the time with like plan A or plan B. And plan A is the selfish route, and plan B is the cooperative route. And so we're good at, it's like with Monopoly, we're good at playing both of those games. And I guess there is a kind of a thrill, at least for some people and for some groups, in actually succeeding at the expense of other individuals or groups. And there's quite a bit of individual differences that way. There was a study. Oh, it's a little bit engaged, but basically it looked at individual differences, and it showed that some people are much more kind of power-oriented than others, and they're the ones that would be exceptionally tempted. But I think if you look at all of the different relationships among groups, what you find is that not inevitably hostile relationships. You find the full range of relationships: cooperation, competition, predation, parasitism, just like in nature. And so much of this depends on creating the environments to stack the deck, basically, in favor of cooperation. And if you don't do that, then there'll be no lack of people that are interested in playing, plan A, the selfish option. So it's within all of us. It's in some of us more than others. And we have to construct our social environments so that we forestall those impulses. Well, I want to challenge this assumption that selfishness is more primal than cooperation, and I think that my great colleague Joe Henrich at Harvard University coined the acronym WEIRD, which stands for Western Educated, Industrial Rich, and Democratic. We live in a weird culture, Western Educated, Industrial Rich, and Democratic. And because almost all science and scholarship takes place in weird culture, then according to Joe Henrich, we have mistaken our culture for human nature. We have mistaken our culture for human nature. And there's so much more cultural diversity out there that it might be true that in weird cultures that somehow selfishness comes first, because that's been drilled into us. And you know, there's famous studies that talk about the effects of economic education. The more economics you get in school, then the more you actually think about self-interest and so on and so forth. It's what you've been taught. But if you look at other cultures, including cultures that we call collectivistic and so on, then we find actually it's not the case.
And also, just demographically, isn't it true that the vast majority of the world's population is not in these so-called weird cultures, right? I mean, most of the world
I mean, this is stunning.
not.
I mean, this is kind of ironic also, because humanists and, humanities, people in humanities department have been critiquing science this way all along. But for some reason, it took a scientist coining the acronym WEIRD to get the point across, and to actually appreciate that there's so much more diversity that's out there. And so I think that it's perfectly possible, and once again acknowledging individual differences, for a person to be a genuine empath. And I actually think that I'm a genuine empath. Maybe I learned it at some point, but I really want to fit in. I'll tell you, if you put me in a group setting, I don't want to exploit you. I want to work with you. I don't want to get burned by it, and so therefore I'm a smart empath. And I think a lot of people are like that, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think that part of this appreciation that we're so much of a cultural species, that we have our symbotypes in addition to our genotypes, then it just has transformed the way we think about child development. A child is born into a world that is just a dense cultural matrix. And that what the child has evolved genetically to do is to figure out the salient. Let me tell you a study about this. Favorite that Joe Henrich it's in one of his books. Imagine that you're a very small child sitting on your mother's lap, and you're watching a video. And in the video, two adults are drinking different colored liquids, eating different foods, and manipulating a toy in different ways. And then in the video, two more adults come into view, and they stand facing one of these adults and away from the other adults. And at the end of all of that, the little child, is given a choice of the two liquids, the two foods, and is handed the toy to see which way they manipulate the toy. And by a huge factor, I forget, it's like 8-to-1 factor, just enormous, the child emulates the adult that was watched by the other adults. That's how a child picks up salient information in their world. They see who's looking at who, and they do that at a very early age. That's the extent to which we've genetically evolved to soak up our cultures. Amazing. Well, I think here we can again turn to any enduring cultural system, including religions, and we could ask the question, how did they do it? And I made a study of Calvinism as it originated in the city of Geneva in the 1500s, because it was like a natural before and after experiment. We had a city, which at that time was just like 12,000 people, which had a strong democratic governance, but was not functioning well. They'd kicked out the Catholics, and a factionalism was called the Genevan disease. And so we had all these factions fighting each other, and then Calvin wrote this catechism and ecclesiastical ordinances, which basically caused the city to function much well than before. And so it actually got people to to cooperate. And then if you look at the Catechism, what you find is that, this is what chapter in Darwin's Cathedral, is that it's just like this amazingly intelligent manipulation of our psychology in terms of forgiveness of sins and predestination and all of this interlocking, fitting together, so that if you accept it, if you take it at face value, you will be exceptionally compliant, exceptionally compliant. And if you're not, then there's all kinds of social rules that exclusion from brotherly admonition, exclusion from the supper, all the way to exclusion with the hope that you'll repent, and so on. This is an amazing system for both at the psychological level and at the sociological level, stamping out the kind of self-interest. And even then it was hard, if you know the history of Calvinism, of early Calvinism. Still it was the case that he was opposed. So it is a tug of war, and I think it always will be. Always will be a tug of war within individuals and within groups at all scales. And so it's for that reason that we need to always have appropriate structure. Structure is needed. There's an essay by Joe Freeman, who's an early feminist writer, called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, that especially feminists and others they hate the structure that's been imposed upon them, and they think that they can do without any structure at all. And Joe Freeman says, no. You always have to have appropriate structure. And that's true from the smallest scale to the largest scale. Small is not automatically beautiful. Even the smallest group, such as a couple, we know that there's such a thing as an abusive even the individual as a group. That's an amazing thought, that we can think of the individual person as a group of identities that might be warring with each other inside you, and that we need to make all the different voices in yourself a cooperative group. And actually, very seriously, my colleagues, such as Stephen C. Hayes, who I didn't get a chance to talk about, is thinking about the individual as a group from this perspective.
Well, and just to follow up, we were talking earlier about it. You were saying that sort of the key to a group is you need to be both well-governed and adaptable, able to change, but you do need that structure. You need that governance.
Yeah, I have said very little about adaptability, when in fact it's just as important as governance. And adaptability basically means applying this evolutionary process, that at all times we need to be flexible enough to form goals, try stuff out, select what works, and repeat again and again and again. And so if you look at the most successful groups and the most successful individuals, there's a ton of research on this. Psychological flexibility, the addition to do that, is just so important for well-being, personal and group well-being. If you have it, you roll with the punches. Yes, you are stressed. Everyone's stressed. But in your case, you roll with the punches and you adapt. If you don't have it, then you don't adapt. And then you just take the hit, and it leads to mental unwellness. So adaptability, there's a whole piece there which I can just offer basically as encouragement to learn more, is adaptability plus governance at all scales. If I understand you correctly, I think the answer is yes, that you can, there's any number of measurements that you can take to see, where you currently stand. And I'm not exactly sure I have your question, but let me just make a try, which is at the group level. One thing that we're developing at Prosocial World is called evolutionary case reports, and is treating either at an individual level or as a group level. What is the history of your group? Every group is an entity that has an origin, it has ancestors, it has a period of time in which it has been in existence, it has performed well or poorly, it gives rise to other groups, and so we can actually study the individual or the group as an evolving entity, and there's lots of measures associated with that. And then at the individual level, I would point you to what's called acceptance and commitment therapy or training. It's a form of mindfulness-based training, which I think is very much and increasingly is being framed in an evolutionary way in which you can basically see yourself as an open-ended evolving system, and we can measure how you are now and how you want to be and how you can get there. Well, that brings me back to this event I was at this very morning. In the first place, I think the United Nations, of course, and the League of Nations before that, is an attempt at worldwide governance. It's an attempt that works very poorly, in part because they don't have the authority. They have some kind of moral authority and a small amount of policing authority. So it's a step in that direction, but you might say a highly inadequate step. At the same time, they're very important for some things, and this being a UN conference that I was at, they are thirsty for this kind of paradigm change, and they have a lot of capacity for putting it into action. And again, I want to stress that this can be put into action at multiple scales, and so if a national regime is unreceptive, there's still so much that you can do in a bioregion or a city and so as long as you have willing partners, then you could actually get going with it. And then finally, I want to point out that in very specific contexts, there are many international agreements, international trade agreements and international environmental agreements, which actually work quite well. And it's important that in just about any context and any scale, including the international scale, we can find positive examples. We can find examples of groups and whole multi-group ecosystems, which without knowing it, without actually mentioning the evolution word, have converged upon these principles. And so we can learn from them, and then we can generalize them. Because so often what you find, a company I haven't mentioned, but that we're working with, it's a manufacturing firm called Barry Waymiller in the Midwest. It's one of the featured companies in the conscious capitalism movements. And not only have they become one of these exceptional organizations themselves, they have acquired over 140 other companies and transformed them as well. And so this is like a replicated experiment in cultural evolution, conscious cultural evolution, replicated 140 times, even though it's celebrated within some small circle within the business world. It's utterly unknown beyond its borders. And there's many examples like that. So there's a sense in which the evidence is hiding in plain sight. The evidence is all around us, and the reason we don't see it is because we're blinded for lack of the appropriate theory. Einstein said the theory decides what can be observed. The theory decides what can be observed. And so if you're not seeing something, it might not be because it's not there. It might be because your theory has blinded you to it. And so there's so much hiding in plain sight once we know what to look for. Yeah, that's super interesting, and I think you could well imagine that in some of these nicer neighborhoods, people walk around together more, and that would be the specific factor that caused you to pick up the envelope. Which could it be? We don't have that information. But there's another experiment like that I think is salient to that point, which is that the letter in this case was sticking halfway into a mailbox. So all you had to do is push it all the way in or take it because the envelope clearly had a little bit of money in it. So that was the prosocial act or the anti-social act. And the experimental manipulation was whether there was litter, whether the surrounding environment, there was litter or not. And so in the case where the surrounding environment has litter, then you're kind of inferring the social norm from the unkempt environment. But if it's a tidy environment, then you're inferring a solid citizen norm. And do you know the very same people would either take the letter or put it in, depending on whether there was litter around or not. And so this was basically some inference. And we've done research on this, that people, when they're just looking at their environment, are inferring the social environment from their physical environment. And so if you show someone photograph of a neighborhood, and that neighborhood might be a good or a bad neighborhood, and then you have them play a cooperation game with someone from that neighborhood, they will elect not to cooperate from someone from the bad neighborhood, and they'll elect to cooperate without ever having met that person. And when we did that study, I felt so bad, because what it told me was that if you're in a bad neighborhood, you see a different face of human nature, starting with the first interaction. Before you even get started, you're seeing a different face. You're seeing a closed posture in the people that you interact with, as opposed to an open posture before the first interaction, because of the inferences that have taken place. And this is, mostly subconscious. So we're taking our cues all the time from our environments.
Well, David, you have given us so much to think about. So thank you for a wonderful conversation, and thank you to our audience.